Welcome to Spectrum Policy 101, brought to you by Policy Tracker, which produces a newsletter, research and training courses about spectrum management. Hello, I'm Tim Jenkins with Episode 1, What is Spectrum Management? Well, we're all of us bathed in the electromagnetic spectrum, from light and heat that we can sense, and other waveforms that we can't detect by ourselves, like infrared, ultraviolet, radio, TV transmissions, X-rays and cosmic rays. There's a lot of it out there. From long wavelengths which can travel around the world to short wavelengths that don't go so far but can carry a lot of information. We mostly talk of these waves of energy in terms of their frequency, how fast they move, if you like. But while there's a lot of the spectrum to choose from, it's finite. We can't make any more of it. So we have to decide who gets to use which bit of the spectrum, which frequencies go to which uses. We call that spectrum management. And in this series of 4 podcasts, we'll discover how it's decided, whether you're allowed faster access to the internet on your mobile phone, or better Wi-Fi reception, or TV in the remotest parts of the world, or radio astronomy, or secret military communications, or to control drones and satellites. The list goes on. It's quite complicated. And it's quite a fight, too, to get hold of spectrum to do what you want to do. I'm going to need some experts to help me through this. So I'm going to start by talking to Richard Womersley. He's a government regulator now in the Cayman Islands, but for a long time he was with LS Telcom, which supplies spectrum management tools to over 120 countries. Welcome, Richard.
Hello, Tim.
First of all, give me some other uses of the spectrum that I haven't mentioned there, just to give us an idea of how vital it is.
Gosh, well, there's everything from communication to submarines to military communications, which I suppose submarines count as part of. We have communication with boats. When you're out at sea, you obviously need to know where other boats are. There's radars that help you with that, and also with aircraft. There are what we call point-to-point links, which connect one location to another location and transfer data between them. We use spectrum actually to listen for extraterrestrial intelligence. There are specific frequencies assigned for that. Obviously, radio astronomy, listening to the stars. There's a very, very wide range of different uses of this very valuable resource.
And there's plenty of it. Do we easily use all of the spectrum?
No, we don't actually. The kind of extremes, the very low end of the spectrum, requires antennas which are measured in kilometres in length, so they're somewhat impractical for many purposes. And at the very, very upper end of the spectrum, the technology we need in order to access those pieces of spectrum is still in development. And so although we're pushing the limits of the pieces that we can use, there are still limitations in how high in the radio spectrum we can go.
And of course, one of the biggest problems when you've got 2 users that want to use the same bit of frequency.
Absolutely, and this is the big challenge. So, I mean, not all radio spectrum is the same. As you said yourself, Tim, some frequencies go further, some of them go far shorter. And depending on what you want to do with the spectrum depends on which piece of it is the right piece to use for that application. So, if we're looking to use the spectrum to communicate with mobile devices, there are certain restrictions. We don't want 1 kilometre long antennas. We need something that's handheld, but equally, we don't want a signal that travels halfway around the world. We want something that stays local. So there's a piece of spectrum that's ideal for that application. If we wanted to do broadcasting, radio broadcasting, for example, again, there's certain restrictions on what we can do. Again, we don't want super long antennas, but we do want a certain amount of coverage for our service. And whilst there's a range of frequencies which are good for broadcasting and a range of frequencies which are good for mobile services, for example, those 2 ranges overlap. And so this is where we hit the problem, because we can't have both of them using the same frequency at the same time.
Okay, well, who gets to decide who uses which bit of the spectrum?
Well, so we start at the top. There is an organization called the International Telecommunications Union. They are an agency of the United Nations based in Geneva. And they, every 4 years, have a conference that's attended by around 200 countries who sit down and decide at a global level which piece of spectrum should be used for which services. So they will certainly, if you can imagine global services such as aviation and shipping and satellites, it makes sense if everybody uses the same. So they will try and agree that. They may come away with a piece of spectrum that says we could use it for broadcasting, we could use it for mobile. And the next level down is effectively the national regulator. So in the UK, that would be Ofcom, who then have to make the, if you like, the policy decisions rather than the technical decisions about who gets to use a particular piece of the spectrum.
That does sound very simple the way you explain it, but there are a lot of actors in that, and that's just the regulators and a whole bunch of users, as we've already said. Can it be quite chaotic?
Well, it can. Funnily enough, Tim, I'm currently in Edinburgh for a meeting that's part of the CEPT, which is a kind of pan-European body that looks at these issues. And they're looking at pieces of spectrum, and it's used currently for the fixed point-to-point links I mentioned. It's used for satellites. There's a request to use it for mobile services. There's a request to use it for more Wi-Fi. So it's not an A versus B decision. It's A, B, C, D, and a whole load of other people, and that's where it starts to get really complicated.
And these discussions, I guess, can last for years and years and years.
Well, they can. So, for example, the ITU process, the meetings they hold are once every 4 years, and in order to have a decision made at that meeting, it has to go on the agenda at the previous meeting, and studies have to be conducted in order to decide or to help people decide whether a new requirement could be met. So, at that level, it could easily take 8 years to come up with an idea, come up with a suggestion, have that studied, and then have a decision made as to who should, at the international level, get that spectrum. And then there's the implementation of that. So, yes, it can be a very, very slow process.
Okay, well, all of those technologies, all of those uses you've mentioned and I've mentioned and so on, it sounds as though there's almost a gold rush that could happen right now for grabbing hold of spectrum. Does it feel like that sometimes?
It can feel like that sometimes. So, um, obviously, mobile phones in particular have been a technology which has come, I mean, originally in the 80s, but now something that is fairly ubiquitous, and we all love looking at our phones, and that requires spectrum to connect to them. And there is increasing demand for spectrum for those purposes. And, there has almost been, I like the phrase gold rush. At the previous conference in 2019, quite a lot of spectrum was handed to the mobile industry for use for their mobile networks. But as we've kind of discussed, Tim, the right piece of spectrum for a mobile network is limited. It's not, you can't just plonk it anywhere and expect it to work. And there's some evidence that the large pieces of spectrum that were given over at that conference are now being found to be not as useful as maybe was expected for those services. And so,
Really?
yeah, absolutely. And so people are sitting, if you like, or the mobile industry has garnered this spectrum for its use, and so far has not actually gone ahead and used it. So that is your gold rush, effectively, isn't it?
That sounds exactly like that. Well, listen, thanks, Richard. Richard Womersley there, who helps spectrum regulators do their job. So let's now talk to somebody who's been involved with regulation for a long time, Peter Stuckmann. He works for the European Commission, and he's devising the overall policies for awarding spectrum licenses across the 27 nations of the EU. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, Tim.
Oh, it's good to talk to you, but I have to say, it sounds like a heck of a job you've got. Those national regulators, apart from anyone else, will be jealous of their own powers and the revenues that they can earn from auctioning spectrum as well. How complicated is it for you?
Indeed, we are involved in this process that was just described. So, to whom to give the spectrum, but also to define the conditions. So we call that harmonization. We try to do that as far as possible to have the same conditions across the member states to enable things like economies of scale, so that devices are cheap enough, or enable things like global roaming, so that can use these services European-wide, but also globally. So this, of course, goes behind. So that's as the spectrum is scarce, that's of course a challenge to balance these interests that were just described, like broadcasting, mobile, satellite, and member states, because of the history, the legacy that we have, but also some preferences for the stakeholders that they're present in the member states or have some interests. This is, of course, can be a challenge. Then the conditions, for example, are also interesting to look at. For example, define the duration. Yeah, you can have these two extremes, like in the US, for example, durations are unlimited. So you can say that operators are more or less owning the spectrum, or you can go the way to be more flexible, to have more innovation, and have unlicensed spectrum. So these kind of conditions are important to set, and this we try to harmonize across the 27 countries.
How important is buying and selling spectrum using the market system? Can't you just let the market decide all of this?
Well, to some extent, you could do that. Of course, what you need first is some investment certainty, that the operators or the players that are using the spectrum have some certainty to invest. And looking at these amounts to roll out networks across countries, this is billions of investments. So there you need some certainty. So then, of course, you can, and this was mentioned before, cases where you have to take these bold decisions, and you're of course trying to predict the future, and there you need some flexibility for sharing, or even the possibility to selling the spectrum or leasing it, not to have these decisions leading to situations where spectrum is underused. So there you have to strike this balance between some certainty, some competition, where you have some, as a regulator, is confident that the markets are delivering in terms of number of players in the market, and you have a certain degree of competition while still allowing for investment certainty.
So you've got to design the auction process really quite carefully and presumably tweak it every now and then.
Yes, auctions are designed today by the member states. So indeed, they are looking at the situation in the market, and then the aim is to give the spectrum to the players that make best use of it. In principle, where that value spectrum the most, and then also ensure certain market outcomes to know that, okay, the players have conditions that they can invest, meet some coverage obligations, but also have some competitive dynamics, so that, for example, some new players are coming in when, for example, after a merger, where you need some more competition in the market.
Okay, so there's push and pull between users and regulators. How much pressure do you come under?
Well, we get, of course, pressure, or have to balance interests both from the stakeholders, but also, as I mentioned before, the challenge by having 27 member states. And here, of course, we have the challenge that member states are quite attached to their responsibilities, because they have differences in the legacy and the history, and they don't want to lose control. We also talked about the term gold rush before. Of course, there's also some interest by member states to get the auction revenues, which can be quite important. And here it's important that we have also rules or guidelines that make clear what are the objectives of these auctions, that they're not only designed for maximizing revenues for the state budget, but rather looking into creating economic activity, and by that also getting very good returns for the member states in the mid to long term. So these are, of course, then pressures that we're under, but as the member states are the ones that are responsible for the auctions, they are, of course, also under pressure by the stakeholders, and we are more trying to be in a position to harmonize and to consolidate the interests.
You mentioned earlier on the need to predict, what what the demand will be for various services and what sort of services there might be available just down the line. Sometimes those predictions go wrong. I'm thinking perhaps about the idea that we had that the 5G network would enable us to use the Internet of Things, so that our fridge can communicate with the supermarket and tell us that we're out of milk and so on. A prediction that kind of failed. It's a very difficult process looking into that crystal ball, isn't it?
Indeed, these decisions are often quite bold. I mean, you're deciding these licenses often for more than 10 years or even more. So there's maybe some risk involved. At one point, you have to take the decision based on all the information available. What technology can deliver, what are the predictions on the market in terms of use. And of course, things are not perfect. So I wouldn't say that you should conclude too early to say one spectrum allocation is not delivering within a couple of years, and then you would call it a failure. I would rather say that you have to also factor in that there can be sometimes market readiness and technology readiness, and this could also then happen a bit later. So it's not always immediately that you're in the situation to judge that something will happen or not after some experience. Of course, we have to, when we take the sweet spot spectrum, the most valuable ones, which are the low and mid band, there, of course, we have to try to make things as certain as possible for the terms of use. And then you have to strike the balance and also make available some bands where you say, okay, there we maybe don't know. And we have to give the opportunity for innovation, for experimentation. And this you could then do in bands that are maybe not that critical, where you can try out things. And the millimeter wave band that was maybe referred to before is a bit of a new frontier. And it's also not a spectrum which is needed for wide area coverage. So in that sense, it's probably reasonable to say, let's try that out. Let's give the possibility to the market to see when the demand is coming and then have it available in the next few years.
Yeah, the millimeter band, it's a very, very high frequency bit of the spectrum, isn't it? And it doesn't go for great distance, but it can carry a lot of information. I've heard about people thinking about using it in factories to help control robots that wander the workspace and so on. But I wonder how jealous the guys with very deep pockets, the very rich companies, the mobile telephone companies, I wonder how jealous they are to grab all the spectrum. Do you have to attenuate that?
Well, there's two dimensions here. Of course, they're interested to get as much spectrum as possible in order to be ready to deploy the future services, to have this roadmap. But on the other hand, they're also a bit careful and not to say let's sell it all immediately, because then they have to pay for it, and some member states are expecting revenues. So they're always a bit balanced there and say, okay, we want to make these auctions when we need it. So I think this is balancing out itself a bit, and then I think it's also then important to see that this sweet spot spectrum, which is really valuable, there are a lot of revenues or a lot of license fees involved. While for the band that you just mentioned, when we go higher, which is more for hotspot, usually the amounts in terms of auction fees are lower because it's more local spectrum. So there we can be a bit more flexible.
So let me get a prediction perhaps from both of you, actually. We'll start off with you, Peter, and say, how fraught are the negotiations going to be over the next while, and what are going to be the principal sticking points, if you like, but also exciting opportunities? Peter.
Yes, I think we're now in the situation where the main 5G, so the current new generation that is under deployment, we have low band, mid band, and high band that is now available on the market. So this is, of course, in a phase where we have to see how the usage will evolve, what are the future needs. In parallel, we're now working on 6G already, which will then be the next step change towards 2030, where we can expect then to mainstream this kind of Internet of Things, smart services that we just touched upon. So this is going in parallel because it can take some time to develop the technology, to standardize, to then get the spectrum. So here we are also in the phase of identifying new bands, which at the global level, which will be relevant then in the next years to do that. So it's in parallel, and there again then the challenge to make a step forward towards European services, because we're now scaling up these technologies, and it will be important to have a coordinated approach when we define these conditions, so that these services are not developed only in some member states, but also in certain scale. And also in the digital environment, we need network effects that goes even further than economies of scale, where it's important to have the size of the market.
Richard, what do you think are the opportunities out there, and what are the potential roadblocks?
We pointed out earlier the issue of timescales and the fact that it can take 8 years from finding an application to getting some spectrum agreed. And I think that's one of the roadblocks, because it's very difficult to look 8 years ahead and understand what we need in 8 years' time. And you know, Peter's right in a sense that what we need to do is be in a position that in that time period, the spectrum is available if it's needed. But there is now competition. There is competition from space. There is competition from other areas. And I think, you know, we've always in the past gone down the road of giving or assigning or putting aside pieces of spectrum for specific users and for specific uses. And I think the challenge now is as Peter keeps saying, you know, there's a sweet spot, there's a piece that everybody wants. And I think the trick is now to understand how they can share that, how they can actually work together so that everybody who needs it, whether it's Wi-Fi or broadcasting or mobile or satellite or whoever it is, how they can actually share that spectrum effectively so that in that 8-year time period or whatever it might be, when somebody comes along and says, we need some of this, there's a way for them to get access to it that's not going to take another 8 years.
Richard Womersley, splendid, and Peter Stuckmann too. Bless both of you for chatting to us. Thanks very much. And I think we've got an idea now, haven't we, of why we need the airwaves around us regulated. And we're getting an idea of how difficult that is. And our next episode will ask how we got here in the first place. After all, it's only about 130 years ago that we realised that there was such a thing as the electromagnetic spectrum. Join me, Tim Jenkins, again for Spectrum Policy 101, brought to you by Policy Tracker. If you'd like to find out more about policy issues relating to spectrum management, please take a look at Policy Tracker's training courses, newsletter and research, all of which is available on our website, policytracker.com.